Good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here this morning. As Jeff said, this is one of the webinars we propose within our R4D projects. We aim at improving the resilience of the European dairy sector. And one way to improve the resilience of our dairy farms and dairy sector is to decrease the carbon footprint of dairy farms. This morning, my presentation is about the way we can implement a whole low carbon system on an experimental farm to bring some information and advice to our dairy farmers. It was prepared together with my former colleague Sylvain Foray, who was also acting for Dairy for Future European projects. It was an Interreg project. And at the end of my presentation, I will give you the link if you want to know more about the results of this project, which was a research project where the topic of carbon footprint was also at the heart of the project. So I will start my presentation with a short state of situation of the low carbon footprint scheme for France. And then my presentation will be about the way experimental farms can contribute to optimize the current production systems to decrease the carbon footprint and to test some specific levels to decrease this footprint. And all the assessments we do in the experimental farms are performed with the Cap2Air tool, which is a tool used in France to assess the carbon footprint. 2 weeks ago, my colleague Elisabeth Castellan made a presentation for R4D Webinar series. It's available on R4D website. You have the presentation and the webinar if you want to know more about the way this tool is working and what are the calculations that are done and the hypothesis in a tool. I will say a word about the possibilities to combine low carbon footprints at global farm level in an experimental farm and the performance of analytic experiments, which is not always easy when you are trying to set up experiments and in the same time you are asked to decrease your core numbers, for instance. This presentation was based on 2 experiments, one led in Trévarez experimental farm in Western France, in Brittany. Trévarez is a specialized dairy farm. The second farm involved in France was La Blanche Maison in Normandy. It's a mixed farm with crop and dairying. This morning, I will only present the results from Trévarez, but if you want to know more about the levers implemented in a mixed farm with crops and dairying and a Normand mixed breed, you can have a look at my presentation at EAP Congress last year, or of course you can send me an email. So first, what are the targets of the national program in terms of carbon footprint? As you know, livestock farming is at the heart of major environmental issues in Europe and of course in all the partner countries. Europe aims at being the first climate neutral continent by 2050. For this, the EU Commission has developed the European Green Deal program and the Farm to Fork strategy to decrease some of the environmental negative impact of agriculture. In this frame, each partner country has its own low carbon strategy, and for France, the national low carbon strategy foresees for the French agricultural sector a decrease by 18% of the greenhouse gases emissions in 2030 compared to 2015, and even a decrease by almost 50% in 2050 compared to 2015. So, of course, the targets are very low. In France, the main sector for GHG emissions are transport, followed by residential and commercial sectors. Agriculture comes third and is representing 21% of the GHG emissions. Within this 21%, the cattle sector is representing 9% of the emissions. So it's not the main sector, but of course it has an important weight and it's necessary to decrease this carbon footprint. That's why the whole dairy sector has implemented a program named La Ferme Laitière Bas Carbone, the low carbon dairy farm. It's a program for the whole dairy sector, supported and implemented by the interbranch organization, CNIEL. And the aim is to decrease the carbon footprint of the dairy sector by 20% by 2025 compared to 2015. So within this frame, we are trying to implement some diagnosis in the commercial farms and to help the farmers to decrease the carbon footprint. And we are also implementing some specific experiments in various places to help the farmer implement a consistent low carbon system. How can experimental farms be involved in this program? Well, in experimental farms, we can test some specific analytic levers to decrease the carbon footprint, but we can also implement a global production system which will be consistent in terms of technical, economic, and environmental results. Implementing analytic levels on an experimental farm, it's much easier, of course, than on commercial farms. First, we can make some specific tests, for instance, on specific diets or feed supplements, and measure some enteric emissions with equipment like green feeds, and this is much harder to do on commercial farms. And we will create a much bigger data set of results if we do it on experimental farms on a regular basis. Then there are some specific observations and measurements that can only be done in experimental farms because you need to repeat them every year during 10 years or 20 years, like all the topics related to the carbon in the soil and the soil observations, to measure the impacts on the different rotations, the way you are managing your land, which impact on the fertility, organic matter at different levels of the grounds. This can be done on an experimental farm, but it's much harder to do on a commercial farm. And finally, it's much easier to have continuous monitoring of some specific data like the growth of the young stock from birth till first calving. It can be done on some commercial farms, but if you want to repeat the measurements on large number of animals every year with different types of diets, it's easier to do on experimental farms. So these different levels based on diets, changing the diet of the animals, changing the management of the ground, of the plants, of the crops, on the rotation. So all the levels related to agronomy, but also levels related to herd management. It's much easier to test things, test levels, and create results on an experimental farm. And then on the same farm, you can try to combine these different levels to reach a low carbon system with a consistent way to create your low carbon prototype by optimizing all the levels at the same time, but in a consistent way. It's important in these experimental farms that we can prove to the farmers that we can implement a low carbon strategy without increasing the production costs, with no other negative impact on the other environmental factors like water quality or air quality, and with no production loss. So our target was to implement a low carbon prototype without decreasing the production per cow, because we thought that for the farmers, it was important to show that this low carbon strategy could increase their profit and without any production loss. To assess the impacts of the different levels and to assess the evolution of the carbon footprint on the experimental farms, we are using the same tool as in commercial farms. So again, it's a Cap2Air tool that is used, the only tool used in France for diagnosis on commercial farms, but also for experimental purposes. So again, you can have a look at the webinar and the presentation made by Elisabeth Castellan 2 or 3 weeks ago. It's available on R4D website to understand how this tool is working and in which conditions we have used it in France. So almost 10,000 diagnoses made in commercial farms, but we are also using it as an experimental tool to estimate our carbon footprints at the start and after using some specific levels, and also to assess the carbon footprint of every experimental farm involved in applied research, dairy applied research in France. So this is a single tool for all these purposes, for global environmental assessment. The aim of this tool is to understand the GHG emission hotspots to be able to prioritize the mitigation options on a farm. It's based on a life cycle analysis methodology. It's not only assessing the carbon footprint, but it's also assessing other environmental impacts and positive contributions for the farmer. So it's calculating the GHG emissions, but not only, it's also assessing all the criteria related to impact on air quality, water quality, the use of energy and fossil energy, the use of water, the use of pesticides, the impacts of your management on the soil and organic matter preservation. If the farm is producing some renewable energy, it's also included. It's estimating your carbon storage based on the amount of the rotation, the duration of your rotation, the amount of different type of grasslands, your ages, your type of trees, etc., but also the way you are managing your rotations. With the same criteria, you can have an assessment of your impact on biodiversity, and it's also calculating the number of people your farm is feeding. So it's a global environmental tool that we also use on experimental farms, and it's calculating the carbon footprint at whole farm level. Even if you are using it, in this case, for a specialized dairy farm with crops, we can use it at whole farm level, whatever the forage area and the type of crops on the farm. Of course, it's based on international standards, and it's regularly updated when these standards are evaluating. It's calculating the raw carbon emissions, but also estimating the carbon storage to estimate the net carbon footprint, which is expressed per kilogram of CO2 equivalent per liter of standardized milk produced by the cows. This is a national average of the carbon footprints for France, and the second line is for Brittany, so it's very close. We have assessed more than 10,000 farms at the moment, so our national average is just below 1 kilogram of CO2 per liter of milk in terms of raw emission, and with an estimated carbon storage of 0.14, we end up with a net carbon footprint for France around 0.83. It's almost the same for Brittany. The differences between our different production systems are not very important in terms of raw GHG emissions, even if you compare plain systems with mountain systems. Most of the differences will come from the carbon storage estimation and make the difference in terms of net carbon footprint. So this is the current average level for French dairy production. So to decrease this national average carbon footprint, we have implemented some experiments. I will tell you what we have done in Trévarez experimental farm, which is located in western France, in the western part of Brittany. Normally we get quite a lot of rain, but this year it's not really the case, and it was not really the case last year, but this is our average rainfall. And we are working with a specialized dairy farm. We have a few hectares of crops, but we are mostly producing grass and maize silage for our dairy herd. Before implementing the low carbon strategy on this farm, we made an experiment during 6 years to compare two contrasted dairy production systems. We cut the farm into two separate farms. We had one production system based on maize silage with 0.15 hectare of grazable area per cow and 46% of maize in the forage area. And we had one grass-based system with 0.40 hectare of grazable area per cow and 28% of maize silage in the forage area. So during 6 years, we had these two production systems implemented in the same background, the same place. And after 6 years, we compared the GHG emissions and the net carbon footprint. There was not so many differences in terms of raw emissions. Like I said, all the production systems based on forage production are almost at the same level. But of course, the net carbon footprints were different because in the grass-based system at the bottom, we had more grasslands and more carbon storage. So the net carbon footprint was lower in a grass-based system and reached 0.81 compared to 0.86 for the maize-based system. So this was our starting point. And if you want to know more about this experiment, it was my EAP presentation 2 years ago, if you want to have all the details of this long-term experiment. After this experiment, we wanted to go further. We knew how to produce milk with an average net carbon footprint between 0.8 and 0.85. And then the question was, how can we go on decreasing the carbon footprint with this starting point? So our target for the next experiment was to implement a low carbon footprint dairy system in line with the expectation of the low carbon footprint national scheme, to go on decreasing the carbon footprint and to reach a decrease by 20 extra %, but also to check the adequacy between our environmental efficiency, the profitability for the farmer, and the workload acceptability by the farmer of the system that we would propose. In the same time, we wanted to have the opportunity to test some specific levers to decrease the carbon footprint with 3 axes: the levers related to feeding management, the ones related to herd management, and some levers related to fields management. So 2 targets: optimize the production system by combining the levers to reach a net carbon footprint below 0.85, and then test some technical levers to decrease by 20 extra % this net carbon footprint. To implement these low carbon systems, we implemented several steps. The first one was to define the global frame of the experimental farm system. Like all the farms, we have some constraints and restraints related to the type of cows we have, the land we have, the grazable area we have, the background, the climate, the soil. So we had to set up the global frame of our next production system. Then, thanks to the literature review, we could select 12 levers that may impact and decrease the carbon footprint. We selected 12 levers that we could really implement in our background. Then we performed some simulations to see which impact these different levers and the combination of the different levers could have on the paper to decrease the carbon footprint. And to perform these simulations, again, we used the Cap2Air tool. This way, we could rank all the different combinations of levers and choose the most efficient ones. And on this basis, we could propose the low carbon footprint prototype to implement for real on the farm. So first, we set up the global frame. So as I said, we had been working during 6 years on the maize and the grass, comparing a maize-based system and a grass-based system. So our new prototype is based on the results of this farmer experiment, and it's a mix of both farmer systems. We still have our 125 Holstein cows. Our aim is to remain over 8,000 kilograms of milk produced per cow and per year to make sure that the farmers will accept our proposition, our prototype. We started with a system based on 2 calving periods. 65% of our cows are calving in a compact calving period between September and November. The rest of the cows are calving between March and May. So we started with 2 months, two times 3 months calving periods in autumn and spring. And our land is based on 130 hectares of agricultural areas where we can grow grass, maize silage, and cereals. We decided to implement a system with 0.25 hectare of raised grass per cow as the frame of the experiments, because this is the regional average. And again, we have a role of demonstration for the farmers, and we wanted to implement a system that most of the farmers could copy and implement in their own farms. Then the set of simulations. We kept 5 main levers that could be implemented for real on the farm, and we combined these different levers to assess the impacts of the 48 potential simulations, combinations of levers. First lever was to replace soya by rapeseed for the protein concentrates. We have a maize-based system in winter, so we need some protein concentrates to balance the diet for the cows. The first lever was to replace imported soya by French rapeseed. Second lever is the use of production concentrates over this balance energy and protein for the diet. So keeping the protein concentrate or without protein concentrate. Third lever is the stage of harvest for grass silage. We have a small share of grass silage in our winter diets. So we can go on harvesting grass silage like most of the farmers, or we can try to have only early harvest to increase the quality of the grass silage. Next level was the age at first calving. We started with an age at first calving between 27 and 28 months, and the idea was to implement specific levels to decrease it down to 24 months by changing the management of the calves and the heifers. And finally, there was a question about the calving period. As I said, we started with 2 periods calving systems. We also calculated the potential impact on changing the calving period to 100% autumn calvings or 100% spring calvings. When we performed these 48 simulations with Cap2Air tool, the average of the 48 potential systems was lower than the regional average. So whatever the combination, we would decrease, the simulation said that we would decrease the carbon footprint. So what are the simulations telling us? On the paper, the most efficient lever to decrease the carbon footprint in our production system, in our background, was to replace imported soya by rapeseed cakes. It could decrease the carbon footprint by 6 extra %. The second lever was to stop the production concentrate, so cereals or compounds, and then reducing the age at first calving down to 24 months or using only early grass silage also had some impacts, but lower impacts. For instance, we are only using 25% of grass silage in the winter diets. We started with this level. It's only 3 or 4 months of the year, so the global impacts at whole farm level on a yearly basis is not so high. And the calculation said that changing the calving season would not have any impact on the carbon footprint. So thanks to this simulation, we had the design of our prototype of low carbon footprint system to implement it at a complete level of the farm. So our system is based on 0.25 hectare of grazed grass per cow. We only use rapeseed as protein concentrates. We don't use any other concentrate at all. We are trying to harvest all our grass silage cuts with the early cuts. We have changed our management for calves and heifers to decrease the age at first calving down to 24 months. And our calving period is still 65% of the calvings in autumn and 35% in the spring. The simulation said that with this combination of levers, we should decrease the net carbon footprint by 20 extra % and be in the top 10 of the lowest levels for Britain dairy farms. What we wanted to do with this system, and keeping this system during 5 or 6 years, was to estimate the technical impacts of these levers, estimate the production cost and the economical results of this system, which impact on environment, and which workload, which potential consequences in terms of workload and acceptability for the farmers. So the levers related to animal management that we implemented to decrease our carbon footprints, they aim at limiting the number of non-productive animals on the farms and limiting the number of days, of non-productive days of these animals. And that's why it's not always easy on an experimental farm where you are also implementing some analytic experiments. So the first one is to decrease the number of AIs with pure Holstein semen. We are only performing 90 to 100 gestations with Holstein AIs. All the other AIs are made with crossbreds, with beef crossbreds, and the calves are leaving the farm when they are 3 weeks of age. So the idea is to limit the non-productive animals, but we still need to keep a sufficient replacement rates for the dairy herd. The idea is to keep the culling and replacement rates below 30%. which is not always easy when you want to make batches of animal for experiments. The age at first calving, we have changed the management of the calves and heifers to decrease it down to 24 months and limit the non-productive animals. We are culling the cows directly after the last milking if the body condition of the animals is okay. If we need to finish the cows before sending them to the slaughterhouse, the finishing period must be as short as possible. Again, it's to limit the non-productive days on the farm. And we are trying to calve our cows every 12 months. Some cows with very high persistency that don't get in calf in the right period, they have the right to skip to the next reproduction period, but only few animals are allowed to do that. So all the levers related to animal management aim at reducing the non-productive days and the non-productive animals on the farm, and they have been implemented at the same time on the farm. About feeding management, as I said, we have set a basis of 0.25 hectare of grazed grass per cow, which allows us to stop maize silage during 2 to 3 months per year. The main factor is to replace the soya by French rapeseed. The rapeseed compared to soya is increasing the milk solids. It has a lower carbon footprint than imported soya, and of course it increases the national self-sufficiency for nitrogen. We are not using any production concentrates, which means that we are less dependent from inputs, and if the cost of concentrate is increasing, we are not affected by it. We have increased the amount of grass silage in the winter diet from 25 up to 40%. This way, we are using less maize silage and we are less dependent from protein concentrates again. And we are trying to perform early cut of grass silage till late June, as long as the grass growth is important. And then we turn to longer intervals because the last cuts have very low yields. So this strategy is a compromise between increasing the quality of the forage and not increasing labor and cost between June and September or October. We could still perform early cuts, but the yields would be very low and mean a lot of labor for the farmers, and the production cost of the grass silage between June and November is too high. So for this lever, it's a compromise between labor, cost, quality of the forage, and protein self-sufficiency and carbon footprint. And finally, the levers related to land management that we have implemented at the same time. So we are already using only grass and clover mixtures. So we are trying to go on optimizing the multi-species swards, testing some specific varieties, having richer mixes with more species of clovers and grasses together. So it's an optimization of the share of legumes in grass lays to be able to graze in the middle of summer and also in winter. Of course, at the same time, we are limiting to an absolute minimum the mineral fertilizer that are only used for starters for maize silage to reduce the inputs. It's important to limit the share of maize monoculture in our production system. Sometimes you have maize monoculture because some part of the land is not grazable by the cows. So you are only growing maize cereals or only maize in this land, and this has a strong negative impact on many environmental factors like decreasing the organic matter, increasing the needs for pesticides, but it has also a negative carbon footprint, because of the very poor rotation. Well, it's not a rotation. So we are trying to maximize the duration of the rotation and increase the duration of grasslands in the rotation to increase the carbon storage, optimize the use of farm manure and slurry on the farm by specific equipment to decrease the emissions towards air and water. And of course, we've been planting some new edges. So we are already in a woods area, and we have a lot of woods and a lot of edges already. But where we didn't have any edges any longer, we have planted new edges. and we have started agroforestry this year. So to see an impact on carbon storage, we will need to keep this and to make some measurements in terms of carbon sequestration and estimation of carbon in ages, and thanks to agroforestry during many years before we can see something. So I will end my presentation with the results after 3 years of implementation of all these different levels together. The regional reference for the same production system in terms of net carbon footprints, it's 0.87. When we started our experiment, the former experiment, we had a carbon footprint of 0.84. And thanks to all the levels we have been implementing, all the levels I have presented earlier, we have reached a net carbon footprint below 0.70 in 2020, but also in 2021. So most of the impact of all these levels are decreasing the raw greenhouse gases emissions. For the moment, we cannot really estimate a positive impact or a negative impact on the carbon storage because, as I said, to see some impacts of the duration of the grass layers or the storage in ages or the storage in the soil, we need more time, and we are involved in several European projects to measure the carbon storage in the different layers of the soils, and it will be done during many, many, many years. As I said, the target was not only to decrease the carbon footprint, but also to have a consistent system and to measure all the data for the farmers that are important for the farmers to prove that our system is also profitable. Here you can see the average diets of the dairy cows of our system. So on a yearly basis, their diet is based on 57% of maize silage, 30% or 31% of grass grass, and then a little bit of grass silage. We had an experiment of fodder bits, so there are few kilograms of fodder bits as well in their diets, but most of the diet is based on maize silage and grass grass and a little bit of grass silage in winter. With this production system, we reach a level of 80% of protein self-sufficiency, which is a much higher level than the average regional reference for the same production system in France or Brittany. We are only using 635 kilograms of concentrates, and it's only rapeseed compared to the regional reference, which is twice higher, which means that we are producing almost 8,000 kilograms of milk per cow with only 80 grams of concentrates per liter. And our feeding cost is only 63 euros per liter compared to 82. So we are producing milk with a low carbon footprint system and a low feeding cost, which means that it is profitable for the farmers. And in the same time, we have increased the protein self-sufficiency. The farm, local and national protein self-sufficiency with this production system. So what are we doing at the moment? What are we testing and what have we been testing to go on increasing the protein self-sufficiency and decreasing the carbon footprint? We've been implementing experiments to graze legume-rich layers in summer, so more than 80% of legumes between June and September. We started 3 years ago. It worked very well in 2021. Last year, because of the drought, it was not possible to perform the experiment during 3 months, and we are starting again in 2 weeks' time. So the idea is to graze during 4 hours per day layers that are very rich in clovers, to go on decreasing the rapeseed that we deliver together with the maize silage. So half of the cows are grazing during 3 or 4 hours per day, and the other half of the cows are remaining indoor. And this way we can go on decreasing the amount of rapeseed, and we are testing, we are measuring the amount of greenhouse gases emissions with green feeds to compare these two diets. So as I said, sometimes it works very well, but in case of drought like last year, it's difficult to go on grazing during the summer. We are doing the same with winter grazing. So this time we are grazing 3 or 4 hours per day during the winter. Half of the cows are grazing outside and half of the cows remain indoor. And again, we are increasing our self-sufficiency in proteins and estimating the impact on carbon footprints. We've been comparing diets with or without homegrown forages like fodder beets or a maize based on diet based on grass silage plus maize cob silage. So you can produce milk with this homegrown diets, but it's not really decreasing the carbon footprint. And in the case of the diet based only on grass silage and maize cob silage, we had a strong decrease in the production per cow. So it's not a solution to decrease the carbon footprint in our conditions, and it would not be accepted by the farmers. But again, it's in our situation. And we've been decreasing the nitrogen concentrate for heifers thanks to homegrown faba beans. So it works. You can replace rapeseed by homegrown faba beans in the diet for heifers and have good growth rates. The only problem that we don't have regular good yields for faba beans in Western Brittany because it's too wet. So when you have a good yield, it's okay, but when you have a low yield, the production cost is increased. So it's a good way to decrease the carbon footprint if you manage to have good yields, but you cannot have good yields every year. And from the land side point of view, so we are making holes everywhere to have a precise characterization of the soil types according to rotations that are in place and the changes we have implemented in the rotations, and in particular to estimate the impact on longer rotations when we increase the share of grasslands in the rotations on the carbon storage in different layers of the grounds, and this is part of several national and European projects. So my conclusion is that it's possible in an experimental farm to combine tests of specific levels to decrease the carbon footprint, but also to implement a global low carbon system where you are combining measurements on technical impacts, on economical impacts, and environmental analysis of the levels you have implemented. We can have tests of ration, feeds, supplements, and measure some emissions thanks to specific equipment. We can make a lot of observations and create big data sets of data that you could not create on commercial farms. And at the same time, you can demonstrate to farmers that these different levels can be combined with a consistent way to build a whole low carbon footprint system. And you can still be profitable because you can go on decreasing the production costs, and you can show that you have no negative impact on the other environmental factors like air quality or water quality. And you can prove the farmer and show the farmers that the production per cow can be maintained at the same level. In terms of research actions, it's not easy to combine the low carbon footprint scheme with analytic experiments, but it's possible. It's not incompatible. It can even lead to new experiments like comparing the impacts of specific feed additives to decrease the carbon footprint or comparing different diets. The main issue is if you choose to have a low carbon footprint experimental farm, you try to decrease your replacement rate, which means that you have a limited choice for your animal when you create batches to make some comparisons. The second risk, if you decrease the age at first calving, is that you might have lighter heifers and lower production during the first lactation. So it might impact again your experiments. You need a very good calves and heifer management, but it's completely in line with the 3R's ethical approach of experiments where you are asked to decrease the number of animals involved. For us, we had to change part of our forage system to make a production system with a different share of maize and grass, but it's possible. And it's very important to implement such global low carbon footprint systems to show the farmers, to show the advisors and all the people involved in the dairy chain that it's possible to combine the different levels to build a low carbon dairy farm of the future that is still profitable and has no negative impacts on the other environmental outputs. It's also important to show the farmers that it can be done without impacting too much the workload. It is impacting the workload because our rotations are more diversified. And so it may bring more complexity in the management of the herd. And of course, you need some transition. But an experimental farm has a strong role of demonstration for the whole dairy chain, and implementing a low carbon dairy farm on an experimental site has a strong role of demonstration for all the actors. This is why it has been done in many experimental farms in Europe. I show you here the map of Dairy for Future projects, where many experimental farms of Western Europe have assessed their carbon footprint and have worked on specific levels to decrease this carbon footprint. If you want to know more about this program and if you want to have more details about what the different experimental sites have done within this program, you can go to you can visit Dairy for Future website, and you can find a document, the final document in several languages, where you have the description of all the actions that have been implemented on commercial farms and on experimental farms to decrease or to assess and to decrease the carbon footprints of dairy farms. Thank you for your attention. And if you have some questions about what we've been doing in Trévarez or other topics I have developed during this presentation, I am ready for your questions.
Thank you, Valérie. And there are some questions about reducing CO2 impact. Abel, you want to ask a question?
Yeah.
We can't hear you.
You have to turn on the microphone.
Thank you very much, Valérie. We were also impressed by your presentation a year ago at EAP, a little bit the same topic, I think. Just please 2 questions. At the middle of your presentation, you showed France data of, I believe, 10,000 farms, and you made the statement, we do not see much difference or no difference between systems. And then you continue, and at the end, you do show differences between farms, I believe, or between certain approaches on the farm. So I was not sure how you do not find difference between systems if you have so many data which you had. That was
what I said
to prepare you. And the second I had in mind, that is that you make several changes on the farm, quite applied changes, so that's very nice. They are possible for a farmer. They probably don't even need such huge big investments as we are sometimes talking about in our country. I was wondering till which percentage you think the CO2 you can reduce in that way, in a reasonable way, if you precisely execute your plan. Is that now 15 or 10 or perhaps 20? And secondly, some of the practices you show, I think are a little bit opposite ammonia emission. So in other words, would you not also add a page in which you make the connection to ammonia emission? Because if you harvest earlier, yeah, that's wonderful for one measure, but I don't think it works for the other, which is also important in your country and mine. So a little bit about, if you only go one route, you will see that it sometimes conflicts with other routes, which are also important. Thank you.
So first question about the differences between systems. When you assess the raw greenhouse gases emissions, so without carbon sequestration, in average, there is no difference. The difference between production systems are very limited if you take the average. And if you look at Jason's webinar last week for Northern Ireland, it was the same conclusion. And I think in many countries, it's the same conclusion. If you make the average per type of production systems in terms of raw emissions, there are differences between farms. But if you take the average, like you compare the different type of production systems, we don't have a big difference between a maize-based plain system and a grass-based mountain system. If you compare a Britain system with a system from Eastern France, Eastern mountains, in terms of raw emissions, the difference in average is not very high. But if you take the carbon sequestration into account and you calculate the net carbon footprint by difference, then you see differences between production systems because the share of grass is not the same. And I think in every country, if you look at one type of production system, you see a lot of differences between the farms. But when you compare the average systems, then there are not so many differences. So there are lots of there's a lot of room for changes and progress within one production system, comparing the farms, the top 10% or the bottom 10%. But comparing the different types of production system in the same production background, there are not so many differences. What makes the difference is clearly the carbon storage in grass-based systems. That was my my point. Then you said, to which extent can we decrease the carbon footprint? We think that we can go on decreasing the carbon footprint down to 0.5 or 0.4. That would be honest. Reaching zero, it means that you are working only on the storage. The farms or the system that say that they are carbon neutral, it's because they have a huge compensation by carbon storage in the edges or by planting trees, etc., etc. If we want to be honest in our production systems, if we can manage to go down to 0.5 or 0.4, it will be a good implementation of all the technical levels that we have at the moment. And it would not be cheating with the figures. We will visit some neutral carbon farms soon, and I guess that they will have many, many hectares of trees or agroforestry to compensate and reach the zero. I don't think we are able to reach the zero without having many hectares of trees or edges. It would not be honest to say that. I'm not a specialist of ammonia emissions, but as I told, and as Elizabeth told also, Cap2Air tool is also calculating the ammonia emissions. As long as I remember, when we made the complete calculation, we were not increasing the ammonia emissions. But I'm not a specialist, so it's grass silage. It's only 40% of the winter diet. So this issue about early cuts, it's not really affecting a lot the global carbon footprints because it's only a small share of the winter diets, and we only have 3 or 4 months of winter. So altogether, it doesn't have a very strong impact. If it has an impact on the ammonia emissions, I don't think it will be very important in the global carbon footprint of 1 year of farming.
Thank you, Valérie.
Valérie, there was another question in the chat.
I can see.
Read it.
Yes, we have changed several points. And one point is that the figures I've shown for the period 2013 and 2017 were based on the calculation standards of the carbon footprint until 2020 or 2021. And the reason why I didn't add 2021 is because the standards, the IPCC standards, have changed in 2021. And so my figures would not be completely consistent. And as Sylvain has left our company, I cannot recalculate all the carbon footprints with the same system. So I think that's why there is a slight difference. It's 0.83 instead of 0.84 between the periods. It's because the standards, the IPCC standards and the warming factor have changed a little bit. And that's why it's not completely consistent. There is one point about the decrease of the footprint related to calves and heifer management. That is very important, and it has a role in the calculation. If you want to decrease the age at first calving down to 24 months, you mustn't do it with an increase of concentrates. One way to speed up the growth is to increase the delivery of concentrates. But in fact, if you do it that way, you increase your production costs and you increase your carbon footprint. This target of 24 months must only be reached by a better management of the milk, of the health of the cows, having less losses, less diseases, better quality forages. You must reach it this way. If you try to increase the growth rate and speed up the growth to decrease the age at first calving by using more concentrates, then it's negative for profit and it's negative for the carbon footprint.
Thank you, Valérie. I can confirm this last expression by proper experience. If you want to have the heifers ready with 24 months, it's even complicated to set them to pasture with 16 months, because then they grow not, I think that they grow not fast enough. And then you need to feed them during 2 years completely inside, maybe even with some maize. And then maybe it's not the goal of what we want to achieve.
It's been a real fight with my colleagues working on heifers, because we used to keep the worst paddocks for the heifers and the best one for the cows, and we had to change completely our mind and to give the same quality of grass for the heifers, the same quality of grass mixtures for grazing, but also for the winter stocks as the dairy cows, because if you don't do that, you don't manage to have the right weight for insemination, and you don't reach your 24 months of age. So you need very good quality forages for the heifers and the same quality as for the cows if you want to do it without increasing the concentrates.
Yeah, or
so it's a change of mind.
Yeah. Or you accept to have 26 months with low quality of grass, but to have a good utilization maybe of pastures you cannot use with dairy cows, for example. Are there other questions? If not, I will just share my screen. Maybe we can say something about the next. To find it here. About the future program. Okay. So first, I want to thank Valérie for this webinar. If there are no other questions, the webinar has been recorded, and it will, as all the webinars we did till now, be on our webpage and on our YouTube channel. We know that there are not always a lot of people, but you can still have a look at this presentation or share it. We will also send it to all the people, to our audience. How we will continue in next week, there will be a webinar about from our colleagues from Wallonia. We will send the invitation right today or tomorrow to all of you. It will be about forage management. There will be Caroline Batteux talking about decision tools to help to improve forage. And then Mr. Batti will talk also about monitoring different softwares to monitor grassland. And then on the 21st of June, there will be a webinar about the Italian dairy sector. Probably this one will be in Italian language, and it will be you will have to profit of the video with translation, because there will be some farmers talking, and they prefer to talk in their language, but we will assure a translation of the video material. And then the day after, our colleagues from Inagro from Flanders will present a webinar about claw health, how this better claw health is improving resilience in Flemish farms. And then there is one, but maybe we'll have some others between this, which is already confirmed, is in September, about the resilience of the Finnish dairy sector. The most important is that you can have all this information on our webpage, on our different YouTube channel, Facebook. So if you miss some information. So that's about what will come next. So if,
thank you, Jeff.
Yes, if there's no other remark, thank you, all of you, for being with us. Thank you again, Valérie. Then we will see you soon in the next webinar.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Thank you.